Roman II Woman in France, Madame de Sable 31, by George Eliot. In 1847, a certain Count Leopold Ferry died at Padua, leaving a library entirely composed of works written by women in various languages. And this library amounted to nearly 32,000 volumes. We will not hazard any conjecture as to the proportion of these volumes which a severe judge like the priest in Don Quixote would deliver to the flames. But for our own part, most of these we should care to rescue would be the works of French women, with few remarkable exceptions. Our own feminine literature is made up of books which could have been better written by men. Books which have the same relation to literature is general as academic prize poems have to poetry. When not a feeble imitation, they are usually an absurd exaggeration of the masculine style, like the swaggering gait of a bad actress in male attire. Few English women have written so much like a woman as Richardson's Lady G. Now we think it an immense mistake to maintain that there is no sex in literature. Science has no sex. The mere knowing and reasoning faculties, if they act correctly, must go through the same process and arrive at the same result. But in art and literature, which imply the action of the entire being, in which every fiber of the nature is engaged, in which every peculiar modification of the individual makes itself felt, woman has something specific to contribute under every imaginable 32 social condition. She will necessarily have a class of sensations and emotions. The maternal ones which must remain unknown to man, and the fact of her comparative physical weakness, which, however it may have been exaggerated by a vicious civilization, can never be cancelled, introduces a distinctively feminine condition into the wondrous chemistry of the affections and sentiments, which inevitably gives rise to distinctive forms and combinations. A certain amount of psychological difference between man and woman necessarily arises out of the difference of sex, and instead of being destined to vanish before a complete development of woman's intellectual and moral nature, will be a permanent source of variety and beauty, as long as the tender light and dewy freshness of morning affect us differently from the strength and brilliancy of the midday sun. And those delightful women of France who, from the beginning of the 17th to the close of the 18th century, formed some of the brightest threads in the web of political and literary history, wrote under circumstances which left the feminine character of their minds uncramped by timidity and unstrained by mistaken effort. They were not trying to make a career for themselves. They thought little in many cases, not at all of the public. They wrote letters to their lovers and friends, memoirs of their everyday lives, romances in which they gave portraits of their familiar acquaintances and described the tragedy or comedy which was going on before their eyes. Always refined and graceful, often witty, sometimes judicious, they wrote what they saw, thought, and felt in their habitual language, without proposing any model to themselves, without any intention to prove that women could write as well as men, without affecting manly views or suppressing womanly ones. One may say, at least with regard to the women of the 17th century, that their writings were but a charming accident of their more charming lives, like the petals which the wind shakes from the rose in its bloom. And it is but a twin fact with this, that in France alone woman has had a vital influence on the development 33 of literature. In France alone, the mind of woman has passed like an electric current through the language, making crisp and definite what is elsewhere heavy and blurred. In France alone, if the writings of women were swept away, a serious gap would be made in the national history. Patriotic gallantry may perhaps contend that English women could, if they had liked, have written as well as their neighbors, but we will leave the consideration of that question to the reviewers of the literature that might have been in the literature that actually is. We must turn to France for the highest examples of womanly achievement in almost every department. We confess ourselves unacquainted with the productions of those awful women of Italy who held professorial chairs and were great in civil and canon law. We have made no researches into the catacombs of female literature, but we think we may safely conclude that they would yield no rivals to that which is still unburied, and here we suppose the question of preeminence can only lie between England and France. And to this day Madame de Sévigné remains the single instance of a woman who is supreme in a class of literature which has engaged the ambition of men. Madame Dacier still reigns the queen of blue stockings, though women have long studied Greek without shame. 33 Madame de Staël's name still rises first to the lips when we are asked to mention a woman of great intellectual power. Madame Roland is still the unrivaled type of the sagacious and sternly heroic, yet lovable woman. George Sand is the unapproached artist who, to Jean-Jacques' eloquence and deep sense of external nature, unites the clear delineation of character and the tragic depth of passion. These great names, which mark different epochs, soar like tall pines amidst a forest of less conspicuous, but not less fascinating female writers, and beneath these again are p. 34 spread like a thicket of hawthorns, eglantines, and honeysuckles, the women who are known rather by what they stimulated men to write than by what they wrote themselves. Women whose tact, wit, and personal radiance created the atmosphere of the salon, where literature, philosophy, and science, emancipated from the trammels of pedantry and technicality, entered on a brighter stage of existence. What were the causes of this earlier development and more abundant manifestation of womanly intellect in France? The primary one perhaps lies in the physiological characteristics of the Gallic race: small brain and vivacious temperament, which permit the fragile system of woman to sustain the superlative activity requisite for intellectual creativeness, while on the other hand, the larger brain and slower temperament of the English and Germans are in the womanly organization generally dreamy and passive. The type of humanity in the latter may be grander, but it requires a larger sum of conditions to produce a perfect specimen throughout the animal world. The higher the organization, the more frequent is the departure from the normal form. We do not often see imperfectly developed or ill-made insects, but we rarely see a perfectly developed, well-made man. And thus the physique of a woman may suffice as the substratum for a superior Gallic mind, but is too thin a soil for a superior Teutonic one. Our theory is borne out by the fact that among our own countrywomen, those who distinguish themselves by literary production more frequently approach the Gallic than the Teutonic type. They are intense and rapid rather than comprehensive. The woman of large capacity can seldom rise beyond the absorption of ideas. Her physical conditions refuse to support the energy required for spontaneous activity. The voltaic pile is not strong enough to produce crystallizations. Phantasms of great ideas float through her mind, but she has not the spell which will arrest them and give them fixity. This more than unfavorable external circumstances is, we think, the reason why woman has not yet contributed any new form to art, any discovery in p. 35 science, any deep-searching inquiry in philosophy. The necessary physiological conditions are not present in her, that under more favorable circumstances in the future, these conditions may prove compatible with the feminine organization. It would be rash to deny, for the present, we are only concerned with our theory so far as it presents a physiological basis for the intellectual effectiveness of French women. A secondary cause was probably the laxity of opinion and practice with regard to the Mariagity. Heaven forbid that we should enter on a defense of French morals, most of all in relation to marriage. But it is undeniable that unions formed in the maturity of thought and feeling, and grounded only on inherent fitness and mutual attraction, tended to bring women into more intelligent sympathy with men, and to heighten and complicate their share in the political drama. The quiescence and security of the conjugal relation are doubtless favorable to the manifestation of the highest qualities by persons who have already attained a high standard of culture, but rarely foster a passion sufficient to rouse all the faculties to aid in winning or retaining its beloved objecto. Convert indolence into activity, indifference into ardent partisanship, dullness into perspicuity. Gallantry and intrigue are sorry enough things in themselves, but they certainly serve better to arouse the dormant faculties of woman than embroidery and domestic drudgery, especially when, as in the high society of France in the 17th century, they are refined by the influence of Spanish chivalry and controlled by the spirit of Italian causticity. The dreamy and fantastic girl was awakened to reality by the experience of wifehood and maternity, and became capable of loving not a mere phantom of her own imagination, but a living man struggling with the hatreds and rivalries of the political arena she espoused. His quarrels she made herself her fortune, and her influence the stepping stones of his ambition. And the languid beauty, who had formerly seemed ready to die of a rose, was seen to become the heroine of an insurrection the vivid interest in affairs, which was thus excited in woman p36, must obviously have tended to quicken her intellect and give it a practical application, and the very sorrows, heart-pangs, and regrets which are inseparable from a life of passion deepened her nature, by the questioning of self and destiny which they occasioned, and by the energy demanded to surmount them. And live on. No wise person, we imagine, wishes to restore the social condition of France in the 17th century, or considers the ideal program of woman's life to be a marriage de convenance at 15, a career of gallantry from 20 to 38, and penitence and piety for the rest of her days. Nevertheless, that social condition has its good results as much as the madly superstitious Crusades had theirs. But the most indisputable source of feminine culture and development in France was the influence of the salons, which, as all the world knows, were reunions of both sexes, where conversation ran along the whole gamut of subjects, from the frothiest vers de société to the philosophy of Descartes. Richelieu had set the fashion of uniting a taste for letters with the habits of polite society and the pursuits of ambition, and in the first quarter of the 17th century, there were already several hotels in Paris, varying in social position from the closest proximity of the court to the debatable ground of the aristocracy, and the bourgeoisie, which served as a rendezvous for different circles of people bent on entertaining themselves either by showing talent or admiring it. The most celebrated of these rendezvous was the Hôtel de Rambouillet, which was at the culmination of its glory in 1630 and did not become quite extinct until 1648, when the troubles of the Fronde commencing its habitués were dispersed or absorbed by political interests. The presiding genius of this salon, the Marquise de Rambouillet, was the very model of the woman who can act as an amalgam to the most incongruous elements, beautiful, but not preoccupied by coquetry or passion, an enthusiastic admirer of talent, but with no pretensions to talent on her own part, exquisitely refined in language and manners, p37, but warm and generous withal, not given to entertain her guests with her own compositions, or to paralyze them by her universal knowledge. She had once meant to learn Latin, but had been prevented by an illness. Perhaps she was all the better acquainted with Italian and Spanish productions, which, in default of a national literature, were then the intellectual pabulum of all cultivated persons in France, who are unable to read the classics in her mild, agreeable presence. Was accomplished that blending of the heightened chivalry of Spain with the caustic wit and refined irony of Italy, which issued in the creation of a new standard of tasteth combination of the utmost exaltation in sentiment with the utmost simplicity of language. Women are peculiarly fitted to further such a combination, first from their greater tendency to mingle affection and imagination with passion, and thus subtilize it into sentiment, and next from that dread of what overtaxes their intellectual energies, either by difficulty or monotony, which gives them an instinctive fondness for lightness of treatment and airiness of expression, thus making them cut short all prolixity and reject all heaviness when these womanly characteristics were brought into conversational contact with the materials furnished by such minds as those of Richelieu, Corneille, the great Condé, Balzac, and Bossuet. It is no wonder that the result was something piquant and charming. Those famous habitués of the Hôtel de Rambouillet did not apparently first lay themselves out to entertain the ladies with grimacing small talk, and then take each other by the sword knot to discuss matters of real interest in a corner. They rather sought to present their best ideas in the guise most acceptable to intelligent and accomplished women, and the conversation was not of literature only, war, politics, religion, the lightest details of daily news. Everything was admissible, if only it were treated with refinement and intelligence. The Hôtel de Rambouillet was no mere literary reunion. It included hommes d'affaires and soldiers as well as authors, and in such a circle women would not become bas blues or dreamy p38 moralizers, ignorant of the world and of human nature, but intelligent observers of character and events. It is easy to understand, however, that with the herd of imitators who in Paris and the provinces aped the style of this famous salon, simplicity degenerated into affectation, and nobility of sentiment was replaced by an inflated effort to outstrip nature, so that the genre précis drew down the satire, which reached its climax in the Précieuses, ridicules, and les femmes savantes, the former of which appeared in 1660 and the latter in 1673. But Madelon and Caltrose are the lineal descendants of Mademoiselle Scudery and her satellites quite as much as of the Hôtel de Rambouillet. The society which assembled every Saturday in her salon was exclusively literary, and although occasionally visited by a few persons of high birth bourgeois in its tone, and enamored of madrigals, sonnets, stanzas, and bouts rhymes. The affectation that decks trivial things in fine language belongs essentially to a class which sees another above it, and is uneasy in the sense of its inferiority, and this affectation is precisely the opposite of the original genre presea. Another center from which feminine influence radiated into the national literature was the Palais du Luxembourg, where Mademoiselle d'Orléans, in disgrace at court on account of her share in the Fronde, held a little court of her own, and for want of anything else to employ her active spirit, busied herself with literature. One fine morning, it occurred to this princess to ask all the persons who frequented her court, among whom were Madame de Sévigné, Madame de Lafayette, and La Rochefoucauld, to write their own portraits, and she at once set the example. It was understood that defects and virtues were to be spoken of with like candor. The idea was carried out. Those who were not clever or bold enough to write for themselves, employing the pen of a friend. Such, says Roman 1000 cousin, was the pastime of Mademoiselle and her friends during the years 1657 and 1658. From this pastime proceeded a complete literature in 1659. Segrais revised these portraits, added a considerable number in prose, and even in verse, and P. 39 published the whole in a handsome quarto volume, admirably printed, and now become very rare under the title Divers Portraits. Only 30 copies were printed, not for sale, but to be given as presents by Mademoiselle. The work had a prodigious success, that which had made the fortune of Mademoiselle de Scudery's Roman cess, pleasure of seeing one's portrait a little flattered, curiosity to see that of others, the passion which the middle class always have had and will have, for knowing what goes on in the aristocratic world at that time, not very easy of access. The names of the illustrious persons who were here for the first time, described physically and morally, with the utmost detail. Great ladies, transformed all at once into writers, and unconsciously inventing a new manner of writing, of which no book gave the slightest idea, and which was the ordinary manner of speaking of the aristocracy, this undefinable mixture of the natural, the easy, and at the same time of the agreeable and supremely distinguished. All this charmed the court and the town, and very early in the year 1659 permission was asked of Mademoiselle to give a new edition of the privileged book for the use of the public in general. The fashion thus set, portraits multiplied throughout France, until in 1688 La Bruyère adopted the form in his characters, and ennobled it by divesting it of personality. We shall presently see that a still greater work than La Bruyère's also owed its suggestion to a woman whose salon was hardly a less fascinating resort than the Hôtel de Rambouillet itself. In proportion as the literature of a country is enriched and culture becomes more generally diffused, personal influence is less effective in the formation of taste, and in the furtherance of social advancement. It is no longer the coterie which acts on literature, but literature which acts on the coterie. The circle represented by the word public is ever widening, and ambition, poising itself in order to hit a more distant mark, neglects the successes of the salon. What was once lavished prodigally in conversation is reserved for the volume or the article, and the effort is not to betray originality rather than to communicate it, as the old coke-roads have sunk into disuse through the creation of railways. So journalism tends more and more to divert information from the channel of conversation into the P40 channel of the press. No one is satisfied with a more circumscribed audience than that very indeterminate abstraction. The public and men find a vent for their opinions not in talk, but in copy. We read the Athenum askance at the tea table and take notes from the philosophical journal at a soirée. We invite our friends that we may thrust a book into their hands, and presuppose an exclusive desire in the ladies to discuss their own matters, that we may crackle the times at our ease. In fact, the evident tendency of things to contract personal communication within the narrowest limits makes us tremble lest some further development of the electric telegraph should reduce us to a society of mutes, or to a sort of insects, communicating by ingenious antenna of our own invention things were far from having reached this pass in the last century, but even then literature and society had outgrown the nursing of coteries, and although many salons of that period were worthy successors of the Hôtel de Rambouillet, they were simply a recreation, not an influence. Enviable evenings, no doubt, were passed in them, and if we could be carried back to any of them, at will, we should hardly know whether to choose the Wednesday dinner at Madame Geoffrin's with Dear Lambert, Mademoiselle de l'Espinasse Grimm, and the rest, or the graver society, which 30 years later gathered round Condorcet and his lovely young wife. The salon retained its attractions, but its power was gone. The stream of life had become too broad and deep for such small rills to affect it. A fair comparison between the French women of the 17th century and those of the 18th would perhaps have a balanced result. Though it is common to be a partisan on this subject, the former have more exaltation, perhaps more nobility of sentiment, and less consciousness in their intellectual activityless of the femme auteur, which was Rousseau's horror in Madame d'Épinay, but the latter have a richer fund of ideas, not more ingenuity, but the materials of an additional century for their ingenuity to work upon the women of the 17th century, when love was on the wane, took to P41 devotion at first mildly, and by halves, as English women take to caps, and finally, without compromise, with the women of the 18th century Bossuet and Massillon had given way to Voltaire and Rousseau, and when youth and beauty failed then, they were thrown on their own moral strength. Roman 1000 Cousin is especially enamored of the women of the 17th century and relieves himself from his labors in philosophy by making researches into the original documents, which throw light upon their lives. Last year, he gave us some results of these researches in a volume on the youth of the Duchess de Longueville, and he has just followed it up with a second volume in which he further illustrates her career by tracing it in connection with that of her friend Madame de SABLE. The materials to which he has had recourse for this purpose are chiefly two celebrated collections of manuscript, that of Conrart, the first secretary to the French Academy, one of those universally curious people who seem made for the annoyance of contemporaries and the benefit of posterity, and that of Valent, who was at once the physician, the secretary, and general steward of Madame de SABLE, and who, with or without her permission, possessed himself of the letters addressed to her by her numerous correspondents during the latter part of her life, and of various papers having some personal or literary interest attached to them. From these stores, Roman 1000 Cousin has selected many documents previously unedited, and though he often leaves us something to desire in the arrangement of his materials, this volume of his on Madame de SABLE is very acceptable to us, for she interests us quite enough to carry us through more than 300 pages of rather scattered narrative, and through an appendix of correspondence in small type. Roman 1000 Cousin justly appreciates her character as un heureux mélange de racine, d'esprit, d'agrément, et de bonté, and perhaps there are few better specimens of the woman who is extreme in nothing but sympathetic in all things, who affects us by no special quality, but by her entire being, whose nature has no tons creuds, but is like those textures which P42, from their harmonious blending of all colors, give repose to the eye, and do not weary us, though we see them every day. Madame de SABLE is also a striking example of the one order of influence which woman has exercised over literature in France, and on this ground, as well as intrinsically, she is worth studying. If the reader agrees with us, he will perhaps be inclined, as we are, to dwell a little on the chief points in her life and character. Madeleine de Souver, daughter of the Marquis of Courtenvaux, a nobleman distinguished enough to be chosen as governor of Louis Roman XIII, was born in 1599 on the threshold of that 17th century, the brilliant genius of which is mildly reflected in her mind and history. Thus, when in 1635 her more celebrated friend, Mademoiselle de Bourbon, afterward the Duchess de Longueville, made her appearance at the Hôtel de Rambouillet, Madame de SABLE had nearly crossed that tableland of maturity which precedes a woman's descent toward old age. She had been married in 1614 to Philippe Emmanuel de Laval Montmorency, Seigneur de Bois Dauphin and Marquis de SABLE, of whom nothing further is known than that he died in 1640, leaving her the richer by 4 children. but with a fortune considerably embarrassed, with beauty and high rank added to the mental attractions of which we have abundant evidence. We may well believe that Madame de Sable's youth was brilliant for her beauty. We have the testimony of sober Madame de Motteville, who also speaks of her as having beaucoup de lumière et de sincérité, and in the following passage very graphically indicates one phase of Madame de Sable's character. The Marquise de Sable was one of those whose beauty made the most noise when the Queen came into France. But if she was amiable, she was still more desirous of appearing, so this lady's self-love rendered her too sensitive to the regard which men exhibited toward her. There yet existed in France some remains of the politeness which Catherine de' Medici had introduced from Italy, and the new dramas with all the other works in prose and verse, which p. 43 came from Madrid, were thought to have such great delicacy that she, Madame de Sable, had conceived a high idea of the gallantry which the Spaniards had learned from the Moors. She was persuaded that men can without crime have tender sentiments for women, that the desire of pleasing them led men to the greatest and finest actions, roused their intelligence, and inspired them with liberality and all sorts of virtues, but on the other hand women, who were the ornament of the world, and made to be served and adored, ought not to admit anything from them but their respectful attentions. As this lady supported her views with much talent and great beauty, she had given them authority in her time, and the number and consideration of those who continued to associate with her have caused to subsist in our day what the Spaniards call finezas. Here is the grand element of the original femme précieuse, and it appears farther in a detail also reported by Madame de Motteville that Madame de Sable had a passionate admirer in the accomplished Duc de Montmorency, and apparently reciprocated his regard, but discovering at what period of their attachment is unknown, that he was raising a lover's eyes toward the Queen, she broke with him at once. I have heard her say, tells Madame de Motteville, that her pride was such with regard to the Duc de Montmorency, that at the first demonstrations which he gave of his change, she refused to see him any more, being unable to receive with satisfaction attentions which she had to share with the greatest princess in the world. There is no evidence, except the untrustworthy assertion of Talmont de Rowe, that Madame de Sable had any other liaison than this, and the probability of the negative is increased by the ardor of her friendships. The strongest of these was formed early in life, with Mademoiselle Dona di Attici, afterward Comtesse de Mora. It survived the effervescence of youth and the closest intimacy of middle age, and was only terminated by the death of the latter in 1663. A little incident in this friendship is so characteristic in the transcendentalism, which was then carried into all the affections, that it is worth relating at length. Mademoiselle di Attici, in her grief and indignation at Richelieu's treatment of her relative P44, quitted Paris, and was about to join her friend at Sable, when she suddenly discovered that Madame de Sable, in a letter to Madame de Rambouillet, had said that her greatest happiness would be to pass her life with Julie de Rambouillet. Afterward Madame de Montpensier to Anne di Attici. This appears nothing less than the crime of lèse-humilité. No explanations will appease her. She refuses to accept the assurance that the offensive expression was used simply out of unreflecting conformity to the style of the Hôtel de Rambouillet, that it was mere gallimaches. She gives up her journey, and writes a letter which is the only one Madame de Sable chose to preserve, when in her period of devotion she sacrificed the records of her youth. Here it is. I have seen this letter, in which you tell me there is so much gallimaches, and I assure you that I have not found any at all. On the contrary, I find everything very plainly expressed, and among others, one which is too explicit for my satisfaction, namely, what you have said to Madame de Rambouillet, that if you tried to imagine a perfectly happy life for yourself, it would be to pass it all alone with Mademoiselle de Rambouillet. You know whether anyone can be more persuaded than I am of her merit, but I confess to you that that has not prevented me from being surprised that you could entertain a thought which did so great an injury to our friendship, as to believing that you said this to one, and wrote it to the other, simply for the sake of paying them an agreeable compliment. I have too high an esteem for your courage to be able to imagine that complaisance would cause you thus to betray the sentiments of your heart, especially on a subject in which, as they were unfavorable to me, I think you would have the more reason for concealing them. The affection which I have for you being so well known to everyone, and especially to Mademoiselle de Rambouillet, so that I doubt whether she will not have been more sensible of the wrong you have done me than of the advantage you have given her. The circumstance of this letter falling into my hands has forcibly reminded me of these lines of Bertot. Malheureux est l'ignorance, et plus malheureux le savoir. Having through this lost a confidence, which alone rendered life supportable to me, it is impossible for me to take the journey so p45 much thought of, for would there be any propriety in traveling 60 miles in this season in order to burden you with a person so little suited to you that after years of a passion without parallel, you cannot help thinking that the greatest pleasure of your life would be to pass it without her? I return then into my solitude to examine the defects which cause me so much unhappiness, and unless I can correct them, I should have less joy than confusion in seeing you. It speaks strongly for the charm of Madame de Sable's nature that she was able to retain so susceptible a friend as Mademoiselle d'Attichy, in spite of numerous other friendships, some of which, especially that with Madame de Longueville, were far from lukewarm, in spite, too, of a tendency in herself to distrust the affection of others toward her, and to wait for advances rather than to make them. We find many traces of this tendency in the affectionate remonstrances addressed to her by Madame de Longueville now, for shutting herself up from her friends now, for doubting that her letters are acceptable. Here is a little passage from one of these remonstrances which indicates a trait of Madame de Sable, and is in itself a bit of excellent sense, worthy the consideration of lovers and friends in general. I am very much afraid that if I leave to you the care of letting me know when I can see you, I shall be a long time without having that pleasure, and that nothing will incline you to procure it me, for I have always observed a certain lukewarmness in your friendship after our explanations, from which I have never seen you thoroughly recover, and that is why I dread explanations, for however good they may be in themselves, since they serve to reconcile people, it must always be admitted to their shame that they are at least the effect of a bad cause, and that if they remove it for a time, they sometimes leave a certain facility in getting angry again, which without diminishing friendship renders its intercourse less agreeable. It seems to me that I find all this in your behavior to me, so I am not wrong in sending to know. If you wish to have me today, it is clear that Madame de Sable was far p46 from having what Sainte-Beuve calls the one fault of Madame Necker, absolute perfection, a certain exquisiteness in her physical and moral nature, was, as we shall see, the source of more than one weakness, but the perception of these weaknesses, which is indicated in Madame de Longueville's letters, heightens our idea of the attractive qualities which notwithstanding drew from her, at the sober age of 40, such expressions as these. I assure you that you are the person in all the world whom it would be most agreeable to me to see, and there is no one whose intercourse is a ground of truer satisfaction to me. It is admirable that at all times and amidst all changes the taste for your society remains in me, and if one ought to thank God for the joys which do not tend to salvation, I should thank him with all my heart for having preserved that to me at a time in which he has taken away from me all others. Since we have entered on the chapter of Madame de Sable's weaknesses, this is the place to mention what was the subject of endless raillery from her Frencher elaborate precaution about her health and her dread of infection, even from diseases the least communicable. Perhaps this anxiety was founded as much on aesthetic as on physical grounds, on disgust at the details of illness, as much as on dread of suffering with a cold in the head or a bilious complaint. The exquisite Perseus must have been considerably less conscious of being the ornament of the world, and made to be adored. Even her friendship, strong as it was not strong enough to overcome her horror of contagion, for when Mademoiselle de Bourbon, recently become Madame de Longueville, was attacked by smallpox, Madame de Sable, for some time, had not courage to visit her or even to see Mademoiselle de Rambouillet, who was assiduous in her attendance on the patient. A little correspondence apropos of these circumstances so well exhibits the graceful badinage in which the great ladies of that day were adepts, that we are tempted to quote one short letter. Emile de Rambouillet To the Marquise de Sable. Emile de Chalais, Dame de Compagnie to the Marquise, will please to read this letter to Mme la Marquise out of a draft. Madame, I do not think it possible to begin my treaty with you too early, for I am convinced that between the first proposition made to me that I should see you and the conclusion you will have so many reflections to make, so many physicians to consult, and so many fears to surmount, that I shall have full leisure to air myself. The conditions which I offer to fulfill for this purpose are not to visit you until I have been 3 days absent from the Hôtel de Conde, where Mme de Longueville was ill, to choose a frosty day, not to approach you within 4 paces, not to sit down on more than 1 seat. You may also have a great fire in your room, burn juniper in the 4 corners, surround yourself with imperial vinegar, with rue and wormwood. If you can feel yourself safe under these conditions, without my cutting off my hair, I swear to you to execute them religiously. And if you want examples to fortify you, I can tell you that the Queen consented to see Roman 1000 Choiban when he had come directly from Mme de Bourbon's room, and that Mme d'Aiguillon, who has good taste in such matters and is free from reproach on these points, has just sent me word that if I did not go to see her, she would come to me. Madame de Sable betrays in her reply that she winces under this raillery, and thus provokes a rather severe though polite rejoinder, which, added to the fact that Madame de Longueville is convalescent, rouses her courage to the pitch of paying the formidable visit Mademoiselle de Rambouillet, made aware through their mutual friend Voiture that her sarcasm has cut rather 2 deep winds up the matter, by writing that very difficult production, a perfectly conciliatory yet dignified apology. Peculiarities like this always deepen with age, and accordingly 15 years later, we find Madame d'Orléans in her Princess de Paphlagonie, a romance, in which she describes her court with the little quarrels and other affairs that agitated it, giving the following amusing picture, or rather caricature, of the extent to which Madame de Sable carried her pathological mania, which seems to have been shared by her friend, the Countess de Mora. Mademoiselle p. 48 d'Attici. In the romance, these 2 ladies appear under the names of Princess Parthenie and the Réanie de Miani. There was not an hour in the day in which they did not confer together on the means of avoiding death, and on the art of rendering themselves immortal. Their conferences did not take place like those of other people. The fear of breathing an air which was too cold or too warm, the dread lest the wind should be too dry or too moist, in short, the imagination that the weather might not be as temperate as they thought necessary for the preservation of their health, caused them to write letters from one room to the other. It would be extremely fortunate if these notes could be found and formed into a collection. I am convinced that they would contain rules for the regimen of life, precautions, even as to the proper time for applying remedies, and also remedies which Hippocrates and Galen, with all their science, never heard of. Such a collection would be very useful to the public, and would be highly profitable to the faculties of Paris and Montpellier. If these letters were discovered, great advantages of all kinds might be derived from them, for they were princesses who had nothing mortal about them but the knowledge that they were mortal. In their writings might be learned all politeness in style, and the most delicate manner of speaking on all subjects. There is nothing with which they were not acquainted. They knew the affairs of all the states in the world, through the share they had in all the intrigues of its private members, either in matters of gallantry, as in other things on which their advice was necessary, either to adjust embroilments and quarrels, or to excite them for the sake of the advantages which their friends could derive from themin. A word, they were persons through whose hands the secrets of the whole world had to pass. The Princess Parthenie, Mme de Sable, had a palate as delicate as her mind. Nothing could equal the magnificence of the entertainments she gave. All the dishes were exquisite, and her cleanliness was beyond all that could be imagined. It was in their time that writing came into use. Previously nothing was written, but marriage contracts and letters were never heard of. Thus it is to them that we owe a practice so convenient in intercourse. Still later, in 1669, when the most uncompromising of the Port Royalists seemed to tax Madame de Sable with lukewarmness that she did not join them at Port Royal des Champs, we find her writing to the stern Roman 1000 de Sévigné, en verite GP 49 croix quegini pour mia faire que de tout quitter et de men, aller la mise que deviendrient ces frayeurs de n'avoir pas de médecins. a choicer night a chirurgian pour me saner. Mademoiselle, as we have seen, hints at the love of delicate eating, which many of Madame de Sable's friends numbered among her foibles, especially after her religious career had commenced. She had a genius in friandise, and knew how to gratify the palate, without offending the highest sense of refinement. Her sympathetic nature showed itself in this, as in other things. She was always sending bonnes bouches to her friends, and trying to communicate to them her science and taste in the affairs of the table. Madame de Longueville, who had not the luxurious tendencies of her friend, writes, "Je vous demande au nom de Dieu que vous ne me préparez aucun ragoût surtout ni me donnez point de festin au nom de Dieu qu'il n'y rien que si quan put manger car vous savez que c'est inutile pour moi de plus, je n'ai scrupule." But other friends had more appreciation of her niceties. Voiture thanks her for her melons, and assures her that they are better than those of yesterday. Madame de Choisy hopes that her ridicule of Jansenism will not provoke Madame de Sable to refuse her the receipt for salad, and La Rochefoucauld writes, "You cannot do me a greater charity than to permit the bearer of this letter to enter into the mysteries of your marmalade and your genuine preserves, and I humbly entreat you to do everything you can in his favor. If I could hope for 2 dishes of those preserves, which I did not deserve to eat before, I should be indebted to you all my life, for our own part being as far as possible from fraternizing with those spiritual people who convert a deficiency into a principle, and pique themselves on an obtuse palate as a point of superiority. We are not inclined to number Madame de Sable's friandise among her defects." Roman 1000 Cousin 2 is apologetic on this point. He says, "It was only the excess of a delicacy which can be really understood, and a sort of fidelity to the character of Perseus. As the Perseus did nothing according to common usage, she could not dine p. 50 like another." We have cited a passage from Mme de Motteville, where Mme de Sable is represented in her first youth at the Hôtel de Rambouillet, maintaining that woman is born to be an ornament to the world, and to receive the adoration of men. The woman worthy of the name ought always to appear above material wants, and retain, even in the most vulgar details of life, something distinguished and purified. Eating is a very necessary operation, but one which is not agreeable to the eye. Mme de Sable insisted on its being conducted with a peculiar cleanliness. According to her, it was not every woman who could with impunity be at table in the presence of a lover. The first distortion of the face, she said, would be enough to spoil all gross meals made for the body. Merely ought to be abandoned to bourgeoises, and the refined woman should appear to take a little nourishment merely to sustain her, and even to divert her, as one takes refreshments and ices. Wealth did not suffice for this. A particular talent was required. Mme de Sable was a mistress in this art. She had transported the aristocratic spirit, and the genre Persia good breeding and good taste, even into cookery. Her dinners, without any opulence, were celebrated and sought after. It is quite in accordance with all this that Madame de Sable should delight in fine scents, and we find that she did, for being threatened in her Port Royal days, when she was at an advanced age, with the loss of smell, and writing for sympathy and information to me. Agnes, who had lost that sense early in life, she receives this admonition from the stern saint: "You would gain by this loss, my very dear sister, if you made use of it as a satisfaction to God, for having had too much pleasure in delicious scents." Scarron describes her as "la non peril bois, dauphine entre dames pearl très fine," and the superlative delicacy implied by this epithet seems to have belonged equally to her personal habits, her affections, and her intellect. Madame de Sable's life, for anything we know, flowed on evenly enough until 1640, when the death of her husband threw upon her the care of an embarrassed fortune. She found a friend in René de Longueville, Seigneur de Masons, of whom we are content to know no more than that he helped p. 51 Madame de Sable to arrange her affairs, though only by means of alienating from her family the estate of Sable, that his house was her refuge during the blockade of Paris in 1649, and that she was not unmindful of her obligations to him when subsequently her credit could be serviceable to him at court. In the midst of these pecuniary troubles came a more terrible trial: loss of her favorite son, the brave and handsome Guy de Laval, who, after a brilliant career in the campaigns of Condé, was killed at the siege of Dunkirk in 1646, when scarcely 24, the fine qualities of this young man had endeared him to the whole army, and especially to Conde, had won him the hand of the Chancellor Seguier's daughter, and had thus opened to him the prospect of the highest honors. His loss seems to have been the most real sorrow of Madame de Sable's life. Soon after followed the commotions of the Fronde, which put a stop to social intercourse, and threw the closest friends into opposite ranks. According to Eliot, who relies on the authority of Gerville, Madame de Sable was under strong obligations to the court, being in the receipt of a pension of 2,000 crowns at all events. She adhered throughout to the Queen and Mazarin, but being as far as possible from a fierce partisan, and given both by disposition and judgment to hear both sides of the question, she acted as a conciliator, and retained her friends of both parties. The Countess de Mora, whose husband was the most obstinate of Frondeurs, remained throughout her most cherished friend, and she kept up a constant correspondence with the lovely and intrepid heroine of the Fronde, Madame de Longueville. Her activity was directed to the extinction of animosities, by bringing about marriages between the Montagues and Capulets of the Fronde between the Prince de Conde, or his brother, and the niece of Mazarin, or between the 3 nieces of Mazarin and the sons of 3 noblemen who were distinguished leaders of the Fronde. Though her projects were not realized, her conciliatory position enabled her to preserve all her friendships intact, and when the political P52 tempest was over, she could assemble around her in her residence, in the Place Royal, the same society as before. Madame de Sable was now approaching her 12th lustrum, and though the charms of her mind and character made her more sought after than most younger women, it is not surprising that, sharing as she did in the religious ideas of her time, the concerns of salvation seemed to become pressing. A religious retirement, which did not exclude the reception of literary friends, or the care for personal comforts, made the most becoming frame for age and diminished fortune. Jansenism was then to ordinary Catholicism what Puseyism is to ordinary Church of Englandism in these days. It was a rechurch form of piety unshared by the vulgar, and one sees at once that it must have special attractions for the pursues. Madame de Sable, then probably about 1655 or 56, determined to retire to Port Royal, not because she was already devout, but because she hoped to become so. As, however, she wished to retain the pleasure of intercourse with friends who were still worldly, she built for herself a set of apartments at once distinct from the monastery, and attached to it here with a comfortable establishment, consisting of her secretary Dr. Valent, Mademoiselle de Chalais, formerly her dame de compagnie, and now become her friend, an excellent cook, a few other servants, and for a considerable time a carriage and coachman with her best friends within a moderate distance. She could, as Roman 1000 cousin says, be out of the noise of the world, without altogether forsaking it, preserve her dearest friendships, and have before her eyes edifying exemplifies, enfin, a son aux soins de son salut et à ceux de sa sainte. We have hitherto looked only at one phase of Madame de Sable's character and influence, that of the Perseus, but she was much more than this. She was the valuable trusted friend of noble women and distinguished men. She was the animating spirit of a society whence issued a new form of French literature. She was the woman of large capacity and large heart, whom Pascal sought to please, to whom Arnauld submitted. P53, the discourse prefixed to his logic, and to whom La Rochefoucauld writes, vous savez, que je n'y crois, que vous êtes sur de certains chapitres, et surtout sur les replis de cœur. The papers preserved by her secretary Valent show that she maintained an extensive correspondence with persons of various rank and character, that her pen was untiring in the interest of others, that men made her the depositary of their thoughts, women of their sorrows, that her friends were as impatient when she secluded herself as if they had been rival lovers, and she a youthful beauty. It is into her ear that Madame de Longueville pours her troubles and difficulties, and that Madame de Lafayette communicates her little alarms, lest young Count de St. Paul should have detected her intimacy with La Rochefoucauld. 53. The few of Madame de Sable's letters which survive show that she excelled in that epistolary style which was the specialty of the Hôtel de Rambouillet. 1 to Madame de Montpensier, in favor of Roman 1000 Peria, the brother-in-law of Pascal, is a happy mixture of good taste and good sense. But among them all we prefer quoting one to the Duchess de la Trémouille. It is light and pretty, and made out of almost nothing like soap bubbles. Je crois qu'il envoie que moi qui fais si bien tout le contraire de si, que j'ai vu faire car il est vrai qu'il, envoie personne que j'en or plus, que vous êtes si bien fait qu'il, est quasi impossible que vous le puissiez croire si n'estait par ces, pour vous persuader que j'y sois indigne de vos bonnes graces, et de votre souvenir, que de voir manque fort longtemps. Vous écrire il fallait encore retarder 15 jours, et me donner l'honneur de répondre à votre lettre. En vérité, madame, cela me fait paraître si coupable que vous tout, autre que vous j'aimerais mia lettre, en effet, que d'entreprendre une chose si difficile, qu'est celle de me justifier mais je me sens si innocent, p. 54 dans mon, et met j'ai tant d'estime de respect, et d'affection pour vous qu'il me semble, que vous devez le connaître, à cent luz de distance, disais encore, que je ne vous dis pas en mosest si, que me donne le courage de vous écrire, à cet huramise non pas si que men, empêche si longtemps j'ai commence à faillir par force, ayant eu beaucoup de mox et depuis, je l'ai fait par honte et je vous avoue que si. Je ne vois à cet hura la confiance, que vous m'avez donnée, et me rassurant et celle, que je tire de mes propres sentiments, pour vous je n'oserais jamais entreprendre de vous faire souvenir de moi mais je m'assure, que vous oublierez tout sur la protestation, que je vous fais de ne me laisser plus, endurcir en mes fautes, et de demeurer inviolablement, Madame votre etc. Was not the woman who could unite the ease and grace indicated by this letter with an intellect that men thought worth consulting on matters of reasoning and philosophy, with warm affections, untiring activity, for others no ambition as an authoress, and an insight into confitures, and ragouts a rare combination, no wonder that her salon at Port Royal was the favorite resort of such women as Madame de Lafayette, Madame de Montpensier, Madame de Longueville, and Madame de Hautefort, and of such men as Pascal La Rochefoucauld Nicole, and de Maat. The collections of Valent contain papers which show what were the habitual subjects of conversation in this salon. Theology, of course, was a chief topic, but physics and metaphysics had their turn, and still more frequently morals taken in their widest sense. There were conferences on Calvinism, of which an abstract is preserved, when Roholt invented his glass tubes to serve for the barometrical experiments in which Pascal had roused a strong interest. The Marquis de Sourdis entertained the society with a paper entitled Why Water Mounts in a Glass Tube. Cartesianism was an exciting topic. Here as well as everywhere else in France, it had its partisans and opponents, and papers were read containing thoughts on the opinions of Roman 1000 Descartes. These lofty matters were varied by discussions on love and friendship, on the drama, and on most of the things in heaven and earth, which the philosophy of that day, p. 55, dreamt of. Morals, generalizations on human affections, sentiments, and conduct seem to have been the favorite theme, and the aim was to reduce these generalizations to their briefest form of expression, to give them the epigrammatic turn which made them portable in the memory. This was the specialty of Madame de Sable's circle, and was probably due to her own tendency, as the Hôtel de Rambouillet was the nursery of graceful letter-writing, and the Luxembourg of portraits and characters, so Madame de Sable's salon fostered that taste for the sententious style too, which we owe probably some of the best pensies of Pascal, and certainly the maxims of La Rochefoucauld. Madame de Sable herself wrote maxims which were circulated among her friends, and after her death were published by the Abbé d'Ailly. They have the excellent sense and nobility of feeling which we should expect in everything of hers, but they have no stamp of genius or individual character. They are to the maxims of La Rochefoucauld what the vase molded in dull heavy clay is to the vase which the action of fire has made light, brittle, and transparent. She also wrote a treatise on education, which is much praised by La Rochefoucauld and Roman 1000 d'Andely, but which seems no longer to be found. Probably it was not much more elaborate than her so-called treatise on friendship, which is but a short string of maxims. Madame de Sable's forte was evidently not to write herself, but to stimulate others to write, to show that sympathy and appreciation, which are as genial and encouraging as the morning sunbeams, she seconded a man's wit, with understanding gone, of the best offices, which womanly intellect has rendered to the advancement of culture, and the absence of originality made her all the more receptive toward the originality of others. The manuscripts of Pascal show that many of the pensies, which are commonly supposed to be raw materials for a great work on religion, were remodeled again and again in order to bring them to the highest degree of terseness and finish, which P56 would hardly have been the case if they had only been part of a quarry for a greater production thoughts, which are merely collected as materials, as stones out of which a building is to be erected, are not cut into facets and polished like amethysts or emeralds, since Pascal was from the first in the habit of visiting Madame de Sable at Port Royal with his sister Madame Perrier, who was one of Madame de Sable's dearest friends. We may well suppose that he would throw some of his jewels among the large and small coin of maxims, which were sort of subscription money there. Many of them have an epigrammatical piquancy, which was just the thing to charm a circle of vivacious and intelligent women. They seem to come from a La Rochefoucauld, who has been dipped over again in philosophy and wit, and received a new layer, but whether or not Madame de Sable's influence served to enrich the pensies of Pascal, it is clear that but for her influence, the maxims of La Rochefoucauld would never have existed, just as in some circles the effort is who shall make the best puns horrible dictu, or the best charades in the salon of Port Royal. The amusement was to fabricate maxims. La Rochefoucauld said l'envie de faire des maximes, si gagné comme la room, so far from claiming for himself the initiation of this form of writing, he accuses Jacques Esprit, another habitué of Madame de Sable's salon, of having excited in him the taste for maxims in order to trouble his repose. The said Esprit was an academician, and had been a frequenter of the Hôtel de Rambouillet. He had already published maxims in verse, and he subsequently produced a book called La Facette des Vertus Humaines, which seems to consist of Rochefoucaudism become flat with an infusion of sour Calvinism. Nevertheless, La Rochefoucauld seems to have prized him, to have appealed to his judgment, and to have concocted maxims with him, which he afterward begs him to submit to Madame Sable. He sends a little batch of maxims to her himself, and asks for an equivalent in the shape of good eatables. Voilà tout ce que j'ai de maxims mais p. 57. Comédie don rien pour rien je vous demande, un potage aux carottes, un ragoût de mouton, etc. The taste and the talent enhanced each other, until at last La Rochefoucauld began to be conscious of his preeminence in the circle of maximongers and thought of a wider audience. Thus grew up the famous maxims, about which little need be said. Every at once is now convinced, or professes to be convinced, that as to form they are perfect, and that as to matter they are at once undeniably true and miserably false. True, as applied to that condition of human nature in which the selfish instincts are still dominant; false, if taken as a representation of all the elements and possibilities of human nature. We think La Rochefoucauld himself wavered as to their universality, and that this wavering is indicated in the qualified form of some of the maxims. It occasionally struck him that the shadow of virtue must have a substance, but he had never grasped that substanceit had never been present to his consciousness. It is curious to see La Rochefoucauld's nervous anxiety about presenting himself before the public as an author. Far from rushing into print, he stole into it, and felt his way by asking private opinions through Madame de Sable. He sent manuscript copies to various persons of taste and talent, both men and women, and many of the written opinions which he received in reply are still in existence. The women generally find the maxims distasteful, but the men write approvingly. These men, however, are for the most part ecclesiastics who decry human nature, that they may exalt divine grace. The coincidence between Augustinianism or Calvinism, with its doctrine of human corruption, and the hard cynicism of the maxims, presents itself in quite a piquant form in some of the laudatory opinions on La Rochefoucauld. One writer says, "On n'y pourrait faire une instruction, plus propre à un catéchumen pour convertir à Dieu son esprit et sa volonté, quand il n'y aurait que si t escrit au monde et l'évangile G vaudra être chrétien. L'un m'apprendrait à connaître mes misères et l'autre à implorer mon libérateur." Madame P58 de Maintenon sends word to La Rochefoucauld, after the publication of his work, that the Book of Job and the Maxims are her only reading. That Madame de Sable herself had a tolerably just idea of La Rochefoucauld's character, as well as of his maxims, may be gathered not only from the fact that her own maxims are as full of the confidence in human goodness, which La Rochefoucauld wants, as they are empty of the style which he possesses, but also from a letter in which she replies to the criticisms of Madame de Scarmergue. The author, she says, derived the maxim on indolence from his own disposition, for never was there so great an indolence as his, and I think that his heart, inert as it is, owes this defect as much to his idleness as his will it has never permitted him to do the least action for others. And I think that amid all his great desires and great hopes, he is sometimes indolent even on his own behalf. Still, she must have felt a hearty interest in the maxims, as in some degree her foster child. And she must also have had considerable affection for the author, who was lovable enough to those who observed the rule of Helvetius and expected nothing from him. She not only assisted him, as we have seen, in getting criticisms and carrying out the improvements suggested by them, but when the book was actually published, she prepared a notice of it for the only journal then existing, Journal des Savants. This notice was originally a brief statement of the nature of the work and the opinions which had been formed for and against it, with a moderate eulogy in conclusion on its good sense, wit, and insight into human nature. But when she submitted it to La Rochefoucauld, he objected to the paragraph which stated the adverse opinion, and requested her to alter it. She, however, was either unable or unwilling to modify her notice, and returned it with the following note: Je vous envoie si, que j'ai pu tirer de ma teste, pour mettre dans le journal des savants. J'ai mis cet endroit qui vous est le plus sensible afin, que cela vous fasse surmonter la mauvaise honte qui p59, vous fit mettre la préface sans rien retrancher, et je n'ai pas crainte de l'y mettre parce que je sois assuré que vous ne le ferez pas imprimer quand même le restez vous. Claret je vous assure aussi que je vous serai pins, obligé si vous en usez comme d'une chose qui servait à vous pour le corriger, on pour le jeter, au few nous auteurs, grands auteurs nous sommes trop riches, pour craindre de rien perdre de nos productions, mandez-moi si quil vous semble de si dictum. La Rochefoucauld availed himself of this permission and edited the notice, touching up the style and leaving out the blame. In this revised form, it appeared in the Journal des Savants. In some points, we see the youth of journalism was not without promise of its future. While Madame de Sable was thus playing the literary confidant to La Rochefoucauld, and was the soul of a society whose chief interest was the belles lettres, she was equally active in graver matters. She was in constant intercourse or correspondence with the devout women of Port Royal and of the neighboring convent of the Carmelites, many of whom had once been the ornaments of the court, and there is a proof that she was conscious of being highly valued by them in the fact that when the Princess Marie Madeleine of the Carmelites was dangerously ill, not being able or not daring to visit her, she sent her youthful portrait to be hung up in the sick-room, and received from the same mere Agnes, whose grave admonition we have quoted above, a charming note describing the pleasure which the picture had given in the infirmary of Notre-Bonne-Mere. She was interesting herself deeply in the translation of the New Testament, which was the work of Sacy Arnauld Nicole Lemaitre and the Duc de Lines, conjointly Sacy having the principal share. We have mentioned that Arnauld asked her opinion on the discourse prefixed to his Logic, and we may conclude from this that he had found her judgment valuable in many other cases. Moreover, the persecution of the Port Royalists had commenced, and she was uniting with Madame de Longueville in aiding and protecting her pious friends, moderate in her Jansenism, as in everything p. 60 else. She held that the famous formulary denouncing the Augustinian doctrine and declaring it to have been originated by Jansenius should be signed without reserve, and as usual she had faith in conciliatory measures, but her moderation was no excuse for inaction. She was at one time herself threatened with the necessity of abandoning her residence at Port Royal and had thought of retiring to a religion's house at Auteuil, a village near Paris. She did in fact pass some summers there, and she sometimes took refuge with her brother, the Commandeur de Souve, with Madame de Montessier or Madame de Longueville. The last was much bolder in her partisanship than her friend, and her superior wealth and position enabled her to give the Port Royalists more efficient aid. Arnauld and Nicole resided 5 years in her house. It was under her protection that the translation of the New Testament was carried on and completed, and it was chiefly through her efforts that in 1669 the persecution was brought to an end. Madame de Sable cooperated with all her talent and interest in the same direction, but here as elsewhere her influence was chiefly valuable in what she stimulated others to do rather than in what she did herself. It was by her that Madame de Longueville was first won to the cause of Port Royal, and we find this ardent, brave woman constantly seeking the advice and sympathy of her more timid and self-indulgent, but sincere and judicious friend. In 1669, when Madame de Sable had at length rest from these anxieties, she was at the good old age of 70, but she lived 9 years longer years, we may suppose chiefly dedicated to her spiritual concerns. This gradual calm decay allayed the fear of death, which had tormented her more vigorous days, and she died with tranquility and trust. It is a beautiful trait of these last moments that she desired not to be buried with her family or even at Port Royal among her saintly and noble companions, but in the cemetery of her parish, like one of the people without pomp or ceremony. It is worth while to notice that, with Madame de Sable as p. 61, with some other remarkable French women, the part of her life which is richest in interest and results is that which is looked forward to by most of her sex with melancholy as the period of decline, when between 50 and 60 she had philosophers, wits, beauties, and saints clustering around her, and one naturally cares to know what was the elixir which gave her this enduring and general attraction. We think it was in a great degree that well-balanced development of mental powers, which gave her a comprehension of varied intellectual processes and a tolerance for varied forms of character, which is still rarer in women than in men. Here was one point of distinction between her and Madame de Longueville, and an amusing passage, which Saint Beuve has disinterred from the writings of the absent peer, so well serves to indicate by contrast what we regard as the great charm of Madame de Sable's mind, that we shall not be wandering from our subject in quoting it. I one day asked Roman 1000 Nicole what was the character of Mme de Longueville's intellect. He told me it was very subtle and delicate in the penetration of character, but very small, very feeble, and that her comprehension was extremely narrow in matters of science and reasoning, and on all speculations that did not concern matters of sentiment. For example, he added, I one day said to her that I could wager and demonstrate that there were in Paris at least 2 inhabitants who had the same number of hairs. Although I could not point out who these 2 men were, she told me I could never be sure of it until I had counted the hairs of these 2 men. Here is my demonstration. I said I take it for granted that the head which is most amply supplied with hairs has not more than 200,000, and the head which is least so has but 1 hair. Now, if you suppose that 200,000 heads have each a different number of hairs, it necessarily follows that they have each one of the numbers of hairs, which form the series from 1 to 200,000. For if it was supposed that there were 2 among these 200,000 who had the same number of hairs, I should have gained my wager. Supposing then that these 200,000 inhabitants have all a different number of hairs, if I add a single inhabitant who has hairs, and who has not more than 200,000, it necessarily follows that this number of hairs, whatever it may be, will be contained in the series from 1 to 200,000, and consequently will be equal to the number of hairs on one of the previous 200,000 p. 62 inhabitants. Now, as instead of 1 inhabitant, more than 200,000, there are nearly 800,000 inhabitants in Paris, you see clearly that there must be many heads which have an equal number of hairs, though I have not counted them. Still, Mme. de Longueville could never comprehend that this equality of hairs could be demonstrated, and always maintained that the only way of proving it was to count them. Surely the most ardent admirer of feminine shallowness must have felt some irritation when he found himself arrested by this dead wall of stupidity, and have turned with relief to the larger intelligence of Madame de Sable, who was not the less graceful, delicate, and feminine, because she could follow a train of reasoning or interest herself in a question of science. In this combination consisted her preeminent charm. She was not a genius, not a heroine, but a woman whom men could more than love, whom they could make their friend, confidant, and counselor, the sharer not of their joys and sorrows only, but of their ideas and aims. Such was Madame de Sable, whose name is perhaps new to some of our readers. So far does it lie from the surface of literature and history. We have seen, too, that she was only one among a crowd in a firmament of feminine stars, which, when once the biographical telescope is turned upon them, appear scarcely less remarkable and interesting. Now, if the reader recollects what was the position and average intellectual character of women. The high society of England during the reigns of James I and the two Charleses, the period through which Madame de Sable's career extends, we think he will admit our position as to the early superiority of womanly development in France. And this fact with its causes has not merely an historical interest, it has an important bearing on the culture of women. In the present day, women become superior in France by being admitted to a common fund of ideas, to common objects of interest with men, and this must ever be the essential condition at once of true womanly culture and of true social well-being. We have no faith in feminine conversazioni, where ladies are eloquent on Apollo P63, and Mars, though we sympathize with the yearning activity of faculties, which, deprived of their proper material, waste themselves in weaving fabrics out of cobwebs. Let the whole field of reality be laid open to woman as well as to man, and then that which is peculiar in her mental modification, instead of being, as it is now, a source of discord and repulsion between the sexes, will be found to be a necessary complement to the truth and beauty of life. Then we shall have that marriage of minds, which alone can blend all the hues of thought and feeling in one lovely rainbow of promise for the harvest of human happiness.